The morning I came home and found my grandfather's two 80-year-old oak trees reduced to stumps and sawdust, my neighbor Diane Holloway was standing on her back porch with a glass of iced tea. Diane wasn't just my neighbor. Diane was the kind of HOA president who treated bylaws like scripture and complaints like hobbies. If your trash can sat out 5 minutes too long, Diane noticed. If your grass grew half an inch above regulation, Diane noticed. And if something blocked her precious lake view, I looked at the stumps, I looked at her, and I said very quietly, "Okay, Diane." She went back inside thinking she had won. She had no idea she had just handed me the two most important words of her life. Slow reveal of bamboo forests swaying in wind, because where those oaks once stood, something else was going to grow. Not a fence, not a lawsuit, not revenge screamed across the property line. That's the thing about quiet people. By the time we speak, we already know we're right. The bamboo wall rises higher and higher, 15 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. Diane's lakeview slowly disappears forever. She tried everything: complaints, fines, emergency, HOA amendments, even a lawyer. 3 years later, Diane Holloway put a for sale sign in her yard and never looked back. Funny thing about revenge. Loud people think it looks like shouting. Quiet people know better. Sometimes revenge looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. And sometimes camera tilts upward toward endless bamboo canopy. Sometimes it grows. Fade to black. Before I tell you what Diane Holloway did, I need to tell you about the trees, because this story doesn't make sense without them. A lot of people, when they hear the short version, neighbor cuts down your trees, you grow bamboo, neighbor moves, think it's a funny story, a petty dispute story, a suburban revenge comedy. And I understand why they think that. From the outside, that's what it looks like. But from the inside, from where I was standing on that Thursday morning in October, staring at two massive stumps where there used to be living things, it wasn't funny at all. It felt like someone had reached into my history and torn out a handful of pages. So let me tell you about the trees first. Let me do them that justice. My grandfather, Robert Earl Massey, came back from the Korean War in the summer of 1953. He was 24 years old. He had gone in as a boy from a small town in Western Virginia and come back as something harder and quieter that didn't have a good word for it. Yet, he didn't talk about what he'd seen. Most men of his generation didn't. But my grandmother told me once, years after he died, that the first thing he did when he got home, before he unpacked his bag, before he changed out of his uniform, before he sat down at the kitchen table and ate the first real meal she'd made him in 3 years, was walk to the far corner of the yard with a shovel. He planted 2 white oak saplings, side by side, about 15 feet apart, in the rich, dark soil at the northeast edge of the lot. He didn't explain it. When my grandmother asked him later why he'd done that before anything else, he thought about it for a moment and said, "Because I needed to put something in the ground that was going to stay." Those trees grew slowly, the way white oaks do. For the first 10 years they were saplings, then teenagers, then finally, somewhere around 1970, they became the trees I knew. By the time I was a child in the 1980s, they were massive, broad-shouldered, deep-rooted, with canopies that spread wide enough to shade half the yard in summer. The bark was thick and ridged like old armor, and in the fall, the leaves turned a color that I've never found exactly the right word for, somewhere between copper and rust and amber, all three at once, like the last light before sunset. I grew up under those trees. That sounds like a metaphor, but I mean it literally. The swing set my father built when I was 5 years old hung from the lower limb of the eastern oak. I did my homework out there in the summers, sitting at the old picnic table in the green filtered light that came through the canopy. I learned to climb in those trees. I scraped my hands and knees on that bark so many times that to this day, I can feel the exact texture of it if I close my eyes. My grandfather died in 1991. At the funeral, my grandmother held my hand and said he had left the property to my father, and that one day it would come to me, and that the trees came with it. She said it the way you say something important, looking right at me. The trees come with it, she said, like they were a condition. Like they were part of the inheritance in a way the house itself wasn't. My mother died on a November Tuesday, in a hospital bed we'd rented and set up in the living room. With the curtains open and the yard visible through the window, the oaks had lost most of their leaves by then, but there were still a few clinging to the upper branches, that copperous timber color against a gray November sky. She was looking at them when she went. After the funeral, I went out to the northeast corner of the yard and stood there in the cold, not saying anything. Not doing anything, just being near them. Because my grandfather had put them in the ground because the earth deserved something permanent. And my mother had died looking at them, and they were still there, the same as they had always been. The same as they would be long after I was gone too, if nothing interfered with them. 6 months later I moved in. My wife Carol and our daughter Emma. We repainted the kitchen, refinished the floors, replaced the furnace. The oaks we left exactly as they were, because there was nothing to do to them. They didn't need anything from us. They just needed to be left alone. The neighbors on our street were the usual mix. The Pattersons directly across had been there 30 years. 3 houses down lived Ruth, who made jam from her garden and left jars on people's porches, and who once told me that my grandfather's oaks were the finest trees she had ever seen in a residential yard. And then there was Diane Holloway. Diane had moved into the house next door, to our east, sharing our longest property line about 4 years before we did. She was in her mid-50s, recently divorced, and she had bought the house specifically for the view. The house sat slightly higher than ours, on a gentle rise, and from her back deck you could see down across our yard and through a gap in the tree line to the lake beyond. It was a genuinely beautiful view. I relayed this to Diane. She said she understood. She did not understand. She was already moving to a different approach. Over the following 2 years, Diane submitted 4 separate requests to the HOA asking them to require me to trim the oaks. Each was denied because the trees were on my property, in healthy condition, and represented no hazard. The 4th denial came with a letter noting the board did not intend to revisit the matter absent significant new information. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. What I didn't know was that Diane had spent the months following that final denial building a different kind of case. She found a tree removal company willing to write a report characterizing the oaks as diseased. She presented that report to the HOA board at a private meeting without notifying me, and obtained approval for emergency removal on grounds that the trees posed an imminent risk to adjacent property. She scheduled the removal. I came home at 4 in the afternoon to find 2 stumps and a pile of sawdust where 80 years of history used to be. Diane was on her back porch. She had her iced tea. She had her view. She had her little smile and her little toast. And she said they were blocking my view of the lake. HOA approved it. And I looked at her, and I looked at those stumps, and I said very quietly, "Okay, Diane." She didn't know what that meant yet. I'm going to spend the rest of this story explaining what it meant. That evening, I did not drink. I did not call a lawyer in a panic. I did not go on the neighborhood Facebook page and post anything I would regret. I did not stand at the fence and say things I couldn't take back. All of those options presented themselves, and I considered each one and set it aside. What I did was make a cup of coffee, sit at the kitchen table, and pull out my copy of the Sycamore Ridge HOA governing documents. The documents were a 74-page PDF. I printed all 74 pages. They used 4 different colored highlighters. The coffee went cold, and I made another cup, and that went cold too. Carol went to bed around 11, kissed me on the top of the head, and said, "Find something useful." She knew me well enough to know that was exactly what I was doing. I found several things useful. The first was in Article 6, governing landscaping alterations. Under Section 6.4, Subsection B, there was a provision for emergency removal of trees that posed an imminent structural hazard to adjacent property. This was the provision Diane had used. On the surface, it looked legitimate. A report had been submitted, the board had reviewed it, approval had been granted. Except, the provision required that any removal request under the Emergency Hazard Clause be supported by a report from a licensed and certified arboricultural professional, not just any tree service. A licensed and certified arboricultural professional. One looked up Greencut Arbor Services, the company whose report Diane had submitted. They had been in business for 11 months. Their owner, a man named Brett Calloway, was listed on the state contractor registry. He had a general contractor's license. He did not have an arboricultural certification, not from the International Society of Arboriculture, not from the American Society of Consulting Arborists, not from any recognized credentialing body in the field. He had a chainsaw, a truck, and a willingness to write whatever a paying customer needed him to write. Under the precise language of the HOA's own governing documents, the report Diane had submitted did not qualify as legitimate support for an emergency removal request. The procedural foundation of her approval was cracked. Then I found Section 11. Section 11, Subsection C, Paragraph 4. Property owners retain the right to install privacy screening along any shared property line, provided the screening does not encroach beyond the owner's surveyed boundary, and provided installation complies with applicable local municipal code. I read it 4 times. I highlighted it in bright yellow, drew a box around it, and wrote one word in the margin: yes. I checked the local municipal code for privacy screening. The city allowed structures up to 8 feet on property lines. It said nothing about plants. There is no height limit on vegetation, no species restriction, no screening restriction beyond what the HOA bylaws said, which was simply that it must stay on my side and comply with local code, both of which I fully intended to do. The next morning, I called Frank Delacroix, the HOA board president, a retired civil engineer who served as a fair and careful man. He confirmed that my reading of Section 11 was correct. I asked, if I planted something that grew to 60 feet, would that be within my rights? Frank said, carefully, as long as it's on your property and meets local code. I asked him to put that in writing. He sent me a confirming email that same afternoon. I printed it, put it in my folder, and labeled the folder. On the masking tape, I wrote 3 words. I won't tell you what they were, but I smiled when I wrote them. The next call was to Patricia Wendell, a certified arborist with 22 years of experience and a state license. She came out 2 days after the removal, walked both stumps, took core samples with an increment borer, and examined the cross-sections for 40 minutes. Then she walked over and handed me her notes. These trees were in excellent structural health, she said, both of them. No disease, no rot, no structural compromise. The heartwood is clean. She paused. Whoever told you these trees were a hazard was lying. Her formal report used the word exceptional to describe the specimens. She used the phrase no evidence of hazard 3 times in 3 different sections. She also noted that the removal cuts were clean and deliberate, inconsistent with emergency hazard removal, which typically involves rapid, less precise work. So, by the end of that first week, I had written HOA confirmation of my right to install natural, privacy screening with no height restriction, a certified arborist's report documenting my grandfather's trees had been healthy and removed under false pretenses. Documentation that the report Diane submitted was authored by someone without the required professional certification. And Section 11, Subsection C, Paragraph 4, highlighted in yellow. What I did not yet have was the plant. That was the next step. I spent 2 full weeks doing nothing except research. 2 weeks before I bought a single thing, hired a single person, or made a single visible move. Carol told me this was, and I am quoting her directly, a little unnerving, but honestly, kind of impressive. I want to explain why I took that time because some people think I went straight from the stumps to the nursery, which makes it sound more impulsive than it was. The 2 weeks of research were the most important part of everything that followed. Because what I was trying to do was not just make Diane unhappy, I was trying to make something that lasted, something she couldn't undo. Something that would stand on that property line for 100 years if I cared for it right. The oaks had lasted 80 years. Whatever I planted needed to be at least as committed as they were. The first thing I researched was legal precedent around neighbor disputes involving plants and natural screening. I spent several evenings reading case summaries across a dozen jurisdictions, trying to understand where the lines were. What I found was consistent. In virtually every case, its natural vegetation planted on your own property and maintained within your boundary was legally protected, in a way that fences and structures were not. Courts had repeatedly upheld homeowners' rights to plant trees, hedges, and tall-growing plants on their own land, even when the explicit purpose was to block a neighbor's view, provided the plants were not invasive to adjacent property. The key word was invasive. Running bamboo, the rhizomatous kind that spreads underground, has been the subject of numerous neighbor disputes and municipal bans. I found cases in New Jersey, Connecticut, and Maryland where homeowners had been ordered to remove bamboo that had crossed property lines and damaged neighbors, foundations, and drainage systems. Running bamboo was off the table immediately. But bamboo is a family of hundreds of species that behave very differently from each other. Running bamboo spreads aggressively. Clumping bamboo does not spread at all. It grows in tight, controlled circles that expand slowly outward and can be managed with basic maintenance. And within the clumping category, there was one species that stood out from everything else: Philistachys edulis, Moso bamboo, Chinese timber bamboo, the largest bamboo species in the world, native to the mountain forests of southern China, where it can reach 90 feet in natural conditions. In cultivation in my climate zone, it reliably reaches 60 to 70 feet in a well. Established grove. It is clumping, stays where you plant it. It is legal in every jurisdiction I checked. It is not classified as invasive by any federal or state agricultural body in my region. And it is, according to the Guinness World Records, the fastest growing plant on Earth, with recorded growth rates of up to 35 inches in a single 24-hour period during peak shoot season. 35 inches in a single day. I sat with that for a moment. There was something deeply satisfying about it philosophically. Diane had moved fast, got her approval, hired her crew, cut down my trees while I was at work. But bamboo, once established, moves at a speed that makes any human bureaucratic maneuver look slow. You cannot HOA your way out of a 60-foot bamboo grove. You cannot write a report claiming it's diseased and have it removed in a day. You cannot stand on your porch with iced tea and watch it go. It is simply there, it grows, and it keeps growing. And there is nothing you can do about it except stand underneath it and look up. I found Harold Briggs through a nursery association directory. He ran a specialty bamboo operation about 40 minutes away on a 12-acre property he had devoted almost entirely to bamboo cultivation. His website was simple: no stock photos, no marketing language, just a species list and a phone number. That alone told me something good about him. He answered on the second ring. "Briggs," I told him everything. All of it. The oaks, the arborist report, the HOA bylaws, what I was planning. He listened without interrupting once. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said, "Running or clumping?" "Clumping," I said. Stronger than most, timber, he said. Tensile strength comparable to steel. I told him I wanted 200 shoots. He pushed his glasses up his nose. At my recommended spacing, you could cover your arc with 140 and get solid canopy closure in 3 years. I want it dense, I said. I want it fast. 200 at 18-inch spacing gives you wall density in 2 years instead of 3. Shoot growth will be more competitive, taller, faster. But you'll need to thin in year 4. I'll thin in year 4. He wrote up the order. He threw in a 50-pound bag of his own commercial-grade fertilizer blend on the house. As I was loading my truck to leave, he said, without looking up from the paperwork, Moso doesn't forget where it was planted. You give it what it needs, it'll be there in 100 years. I thought about my grandfather, about permanence, about things that deserve to stand. That's exactly what I'm counting on, I said. Before I hired a single crew member, I hired a surveyor. This is the detail that made everything else bulletproof. A lot of people in a situation like mine would have eyeballed the property line, hammered in some stakes, and called it close enough. But I was not in a close enough situation. My neighbor had already demonstrated willingness to use the HOA as a weapon. I knew she would challenge every aspect of what I was doing the moment she understood what it would become. Every inch of this project needed to be absolutely, documentably, legally unassailable. The surveyor spent half a day on my property, located the original corner markers, ran the measurements, and placed fresh survey stakes every 20 feet along my eastern boundary. Bright orange tops, clear and visible, and impossible to misinterpret. He provided a certified survey plat, stamped and signed. I had the stakes photographed from multiple angles. I filed a copy of the plat with the county recorder's office. I kept 2 copies for myself. Some people call this overkill. I prefer to think of it as architecture. You build the foundation right, or you build it again. The landscaping crew was led by Diego, a 25-year veteran who, when I explained the scope of what I wanted, simply nodded and pulled out a notebook. He looked at my survey, looked at the property, looked at Harold's planting specs. 6 feet in from the line, he said. At minimum, some places up to 8. You want it to arc. Yes. Starting at the northeast corner, sweeping south along the property line, curving slightly west at the south end. I showed him the sketch I'd drawn, like an arm around something. Diego studied the sketch. Amphitheater, he said. Something like that. The first task was the rhizome barrier. 60 mil HDPE liner, buried 30 inches deep, running the full perimeter of the planting zone. Even with clumping Moso, responsible installation required this. It was both good horticulture and legal protection. No one could ever claim my bamboo was encroaching on their property, because physically it could not. Diego's crew trenched the barrier line by hand, which took most of the first day. While they worked, I was in the yard with them, photographing progress, measuring distances from the survey stakes, making notes in a notebook that now had 3 separate sections. A soil amendment team came in and enriched the planting zone with compost and Harold's nitrogen-heavy fertilizer blend. Hello, Diego's irrigation sub. Ran drip lines through the planting zone with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The drip system fed from a timer on my outdoor spigot set for early morning watering to minimize evaporation. Harold had been clear. Consistent moisture during the establishment phase was more important than almost anything else. Diane appeared on the second day. She came out of her back door around 11, walked to her side of the fence line, and stood with her arms folded watching the crew. Diego glanced at me. I gave him a small nod. Keep going. He turned back to his work. What are you doing? Diane said. Her voice was carefully controlled, the way voices are when someone is managing something larger underneath. Home improvement project, I said pleasantly. What kind? I walked over to the fence, not crossing, just close enough for a normal conversation. Installing privacy screening under Section 11, Subsection C, Paragraph 4 of the Sycamore Ridge governing documents. I have written confirmation from Frank Delacquia that this is within my rights as a property owner. I held up the printed email. I had brought it outside specifically for this moment. She looked at the email, then at the trench Paula was working on, then at the pallets of bamboo shoots Harold had delivered that morning, stacked and tarped at the edge of my driveway. Her face did something complicated. Bamboo, she said, not quite a question. Moso bamboo, I said. Philostachys idulis. Clumping variety, completely non-invasive. Stays on my property within the HDPE rhizome barrier Diego's crew is installing right now. I gestured helpfully toward the trench. Harold Briggs supplied the plants. He's been in bamboo cultivation for 30 years and will provide a maintenance schedule in case the HOA has any questions. She stared at me. You can't do this. I can't. I've had it confirmed in writing. I'll call the board. You should, I said. Frank is very responsive. His email is in the HOA directory. She went inside. Through her kitchen window, I could see her on the phone. The crew kept working. I went back to the far edge of the yard with the fertilizer spreader. On the third day, the shoots went in. 212 Moso shoots, Harold had included 12 extras, were planted in amended soil in the arc I'd designed, at 18-inch spacing. Each one was watered in by hand and documented. Every single shoot was on my property with clearance from the survey boundary. When the last shoot went in the late afternoon of the third day, I walked the full length of the planting. At that moment, it was modest. The shoots were 8 to 12 feet tall, slender, green, not yet impressive. Someone driving past might not have looked twice, but I knew what they were. I had studied what they would become. I stood at the north end of the arc and looked south along the curve of green shoots in the afternoon light, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I'd come home to find the stumps. I felt like I was putting something permanent back in the ground. Mr. Patterson came out and looked at the shoots and said, "Moso," with a slow nod. "Mrs. Patterson brought me a casserole." She set it on my porch railing and gave me a look that said everything she wasn't saying out loud. Diego walked the site one final time before his crew packed out. He stopped at the south end of the arc and looked down the line of shoots. 3 years? He said. Harold says 2 for wall density, 3 for full canopy. Diego nodded slowly. I'll come back in 3 years. He almost smiled. I want to see the look on her face. I wasn't doing it for the look on her face. I need to be clear about that. I was doing it for the same reason my grandfather put his oaks in the ground, because the earth deserved something permanent, and because 80 years of history deserved to be answered with something that would last. The look on her face was going to be a consequence. Not the goal, but standing there in the late afternoon light, looking at 212 Moso shoots planted in a perfect arc on my grandfather's land, I allowed myself a small smile. Just a small one. Diane called an emergency HOA meeting 11 days after the installation. The request went out on a Thursday. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday at 7 o'clock, in the Sycamore Ridge community room, a beige carpeted room in the back of the management office that smelled of old coffee and was lit by fluorescent fixtures that buzzed faintly at a frequency designed to make long meetings feel longer. I had attended exactly 2 HOA meetings before this one. Most homeowners hadn't attended any. In most planned communities, HOA meetings are sparsely attended events where 4 or 5 engaged homeowners and a board discuss maintenance schedules in front of mostly empty chairs. This meeting was different. I had not canvassed the neighborhood. I had not campaigned. But I had, carefully and quietly over the preceding week, made sure certain people had access to certain information. I had shared a copy of Patricia Wendell's arborist report with the Pattersons, who I knew would read it carefully and share it with people they trusted. I had also made it available to Frank as part of the ongoing procedural review of the original tree removal approval. I had not posted anything on Facebook. I had simply made accurate information available to the people most likely to understand its significance. Word travels in neighborhoods. This I know. The community room held about 60 chairs. When I arrived 20 minutes early, as I always do to important meetings, there were already 14 people there. By the time the meeting started, there were 38. I recognized most of them from the street. I sat in the front row with my labeled folder on the chair beside me. I had dressed carefully, not in a suit, because that would have seemed performative, but in clean, dark clothes that said this matters to me without saying I am trying to impress you. Diane arrived 5 minutes before the meeting. She had a manila folder and a rolled-up poster board. She had prepared visual aids. Frank called the meeting to order at 7:03. He was professional and neutral the way good board presidents are. Not warm exactly, but fair. He explained the floor would be given to the member who'd called the meeting, after which any other community member could speak, and then the board would deliberate. Diane stood up. What followed was a 15-minute presentation. She argued my bamboo constituted a deliberate act of harassment, and the HOA should intervene on grounds of community harmony. She had found an article about invasive bamboo-damaging properties in other states and printed it in color. She unrolled the poster board, a printout of a bamboo grove in Connecticut that had allegedly cracked a foundation. She had also printed statistics about bamboo growth rates, which she presented as alarming, though they were the same statistics I had found encouraging. Frank, with the patient tone of a man who had been an engineer for 40 years, asked whether the bamboo in the Connecticut case was the same species as what I had planted. Diane said she didn't know. He asked whether I had installed a rhizome barrier. Diane said she assumed I hadn't. I noted from my seat that I had, and that the installation records were in my folder if the board wished to review them. Frank asked if the bamboo was on my property. Diane said it was deliberately positioned to obstruct her view. Frank said that was not what he had asked. There was a murmur in the room that was not sympathetic to Diane. She pivoted to view rights. She said the lake view had been a material factor in purchasing her home, and that deliberately obstructing it constituted harm recognizable under HOA governance. Frank said, "Diane, are view rights mentioned anywhere in our governing documents?" A pause. "Not specifically," she said. "So there are no view rights in our governing documents. It's implied." "It is not implied," Frank said. "Not unkindly, but definitively. The governing documents are what they say." He asked if any community members wished to speak. 11 hands went up. The first was Agnes Patterson, -68 years old, retired librarian, best casseroles on the street. She stood and spoke without notes for 4 minutes. She talked about what the oaks had meant to the neighborhood. She referenced the arborist report, which she had clearly read in full. She said the word fraudulent exactly once in connection with the Greencut report, and she said it in the measured tone of someone who had chosen it deliberately and was prepared to defend it. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Then 5 more people spoke. None had prepared remarks. They spoke from the floor, from what they felt, from things they'd apparently been carrying for some time. A man named Gerald, who had lived on the street for 22 years, said those oaks had been a neighborhood landmark longer than any current resident had lived there, and what had happened to them was a disgrace. A woman said she had children who had grown up playing under those trees. Ruth said quietly, in the way of someone who doesn't raise her voice because she's never needed to, "That beauty belongs to everyone. And when you destroy something beautiful for convenience, you owe the neighborhood." More than a bylaw citation, I did not speak. I had decided a week before the meeting that I would not speak unless directly addressed by the board. Everything I needed to say had been said by what I'd done, and by the people in that room saying it for me. Diane made one more attempt. She said she felt targeted. She looked at me when she said it. I looked back. I didn't say anything. Frank closed public comment. The board deliberated for 8 minutes. When they came back, Frank said the board found no grounds to restrict my bamboo planting under current governing documents. He also said the board was formally opening a review of the procedural basis of the original tree removal approval, pending verification of the certifications submitted by Green Cut Arbor Services. He said it professionally, without editorializing. But the room understood what it meant. Diane gathered her folder and her poster board and her Connecticut photos and walked out without making eye contact with anyone. On the way to the parking lot, Frank fell into step beside me briefly. He said very quietly, "My father had 2 elms. Neighbors wanted them gone for 20 years. He wouldn't let them." A pause. He was right. He shook my hand and walked to his car. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. Not because I was emotional, more because the evening had been larger than I'd anticipated and I needed a moment to let it settle. 38 people had shown up, not all of them for the bamboo, some for the oaks, some for something harder to name, the feeling that a neighborhood has a character, that the things giving it character deserve to be defended, and that someone had made the mistake of thinking character was something you could cut down with a chainsaw and a falsified report. I drove home. Carol was waiting up. I told her how it went. She listened. Then she said, "The Pattersons like us." "They do," I said. "That's not nothing." "No," I said. "It's not nothing at all." I've thought a lot since then about what the HOA meeting actually was, below the surface of what it appeared to be. On the surface, it was a procedural matter. One homeowner had filed a complaint, the board reviewed it, the board denied it, start to finish, inside of an hour. But underneath that, something else had happened, something that doesn't get recorded in meeting minutes. 38 people had come out on a Wednesday evening to sit in a fluorescent-lit room and say, in their various ways, that this neighborhood has a character, and that character is worth something, and that what happened to those trees was not acceptable. None of them were obligated to be there. None of them had anything procedurally at stake. They came because something had happened in their neighborhood that they felt was wrong, and they wanted to be on record as having said so. Ruth, who had lived 3 houses down for 19 years and never raised her voice at anyone about anything, used the phrase, "Beauty belongs to everyone." She said it quietly, without drama, and sat down. But I have not forgotten it. I don't think anyone in that room forgot it. The bamboo was the mechanism, but the neighborhood was the foundation. And you cannot build a foundation, not the real kind, the kind that holds in the weeks before you need it. You build it over years by being the kind of neighbor who shows up, who waves, who accepts a casserole graciously and returns the dish clean, by being the kind of person other people are glad to stand up for. I don't say this to congratulate myself. I say it because it is true, and because it is often overlooked in stories like mine. The bamboo was a plant. The community was the point. I want to tell you what it feels like to watch bamboo grow. Most plants grow invisibly. You look away, come back a week later, and there's been progress you didn't witness. Bamboo is different. Moso bamboo, during peak shoot season, grows fast enough that if you are patient and attentive, you can watch it happen. Not hour to hour, but day to day, absolutely. You can mark a shoot's tip against a fence post in the evening, go to bed, wake up 8 hours later, and find it measurably, visibly higher. That first winter was hard. Not because the bamboo was failing. Harold had prepared me for dormancy, and the canes I'd planted were established enough to survive even a frost, but because nothing was happening. The shoots stood at their installation height, green and patient, and the yard was quiet. And the stumps of my grandfather's oaks were still there, weathering slowly in the corner. I had them ground out in January because I couldn't look at them anymore. The grinding crew left behind 2 low mounds of fragrant sawdust that slowly composted into the soil over the winter. I checked soil temperature daily from the first week of April, Harold had told me. Moso shoots emerge when soil temperatures consistently exceed 55 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 inches of depth. I had a probe thermometer on a hook by the back door, and I used it every morning before work, crouching at the edge of the planting zone and pushing the probe into the ground, and writing the number in my notebook. April 3, 48 degrees. April 24, 54 degrees. April 30 minutes and 53 seconds, cold snap. May 6, 57 degrees. Those numbers mattered to me in a way that went beyond horticulture. There is something grounding about a daily measurement, about the discipline of going outside every morning in whatever weather, crouching down, pushing a probe into cold earth, writing down a number. It kept me tethered to something real during a winter that had more than its share of difficult days. The stumps were gone by January, but the northeast corner of the yard still looked emptied out in a way I felt in my chest every time I looked at it. The soil temperature readings were a form of patience. They were a way of saying, something is coming. You just have to wait for the conditions to be right, Carol noticed. She didn't say much about it directly. She's not that kind of person, and that's one of the things I love most about her. But she started leaving. A thermos of coffee on the back step on cold mornings. Just there when I went out, lid on, warm in my hand while I crouched at the planting zone with my probe. She has never once asked me to explain that winter, because she understood it without explanation. You don't lose something that belonged to 3 generations of your family and just move on by the following Tuesday. You carry it differently. You find rituals that let you carry it without putting you on the floor. For me, that winter, the ritual was the probe thermometer and the notebook. Every morning, every number, waiting for 55. On the morning of May 7th, I walked outside at 6:15, and I saw them. Shoots. Dozens of them, pushing up through the mulch, some already 4 inches above the surface, pale and pointed. Like something the earth had decided to say and couldn't hold back anymore. I counted 22 visible from where I stood, and that was only the first third of the arc. I sent Harold a photo. The message I sent with it. She's coming. He replied 20 minutes later. She's awake. Step back and watch. The shoots average 6 to 10 inches of upward growth per day during their first 2 weeks. Not per week. Per day. Bamboo grows in a telescoping extension, each internode pushing out from the one below. And if you sat at the edge of the planting zone long enough and watched closely, you could actually see the plant lengthening. I spent several evenings doing exactly that, in a lawn chair, watching. Carol came out one evening and stood beside me for a few minutes. You know, this is a little strange, she said. I know, I said, but you're going to keep doing it. I am. She went back inside and brought me a beer, which I took as a sign of approval. By the end of May, the fastest canes had reached 18 feet. By mid-June, 25. By July 4th, which I marked in my notebook with a small flag drawing, because I am apparently that person, the tallest canes had hit 32 feet. The canopy was beginning to close in the denser sections, the upper canes leaning toward each other and overlapping, creating the first hints of what would eventually become a continuous green ceiling. The bamboo reached fence height in the 3rd week of July. Within 10 days, it was above the fence. Within 3 weeks, it was 12 feet above the fence. And, from Diane's yard, looking west toward the lake, the arc of bamboo was clearly, visibly, unmistakably there. I know it was visible from her yard, because I could see her standing in her yard looking at it. She looked for a long time one evening in early August. Become a continuous green ceiling. The bamboo reached fence height in the 3rd week of July. Within 10 days, it was above the fence. Within 3 weeks, it was 12 feet above the fence. And, from Diane's yard, looking west toward the lake, the arc of bamboo was clearly, visibly, unmistakably there. I know it was visible from her yard, because I could see her standing in her yard looking at it. She looked for a long time one evening in early August. I was doing yard work on the north side of my property and could see her in my peripheral vision standing on her back deck. No glass, no iced tea, just standing there looking at the green wall rising on my property line. Then she went inside. 3 days later, her for sale sign went up. A red and white sign, standard suburban issue, hammered into the front lawn by a realtor in khakis. I drove past it on a Tuesday morning on my way to work. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. But I saw it, and for the rest of that day, I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over something that has more weight to it than its size suggests. The sign stayed up for 6 weeks. During that time, Diane's realtor held 2 open houses. I watched cars park along the street from my front window, couples, mostly, some with children, and I watched them walk up the front path and go inside and not come back out for 20 or 30 minutes. A few of them drifted around to the back of the house, which gave a view of the yard and, from a certain angle, a direct sight line to the bamboo along our shared property line. By then, it had cleared 40 feet. It was unmistakable. Several of the prospective buyers stood at the edge of Diane's backyard for a while, looking at it. One couple pointed upward at the canopy. Another just stood and looked. I did not speak to any of them. I wasn't lurking in my own yard to intimidate buyers. I was doing the things I always do in my yard, which is to say I was checking the drip lines, adjusting the timer, walking the length of the arc, and looking up through the canopy. The buyers could form their own opinions. Some of them, I suspected, found the bamboo beautiful. Some of them probably found it alarming. People respond to unusual things differently. That's their right. The house sold in October. I don't know the final sale price. I don't know if it's sold below asking or at asking or above. I know that Diane's moving truck came on a Friday, and that I happened to be in the front yard raking leaves when it pulled up, and that she came out of her front door in the late afternoon wearing a coat I'd never seen before. She looked at me once across the property line, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything. She turned and walked back inside. I went back to raking. There was nothing more to say. She knew what she'd done. I knew what I'd done. The bamboo was still growing. I want to be honest about how I felt, because this is the moment people always ask about. They expect me to say I felt satisfied, triumphant, like I'd won something. And I understand why they'd expect that. The narrative seems to call for it. But that's not what I felt. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name, something closer to sadness. Though not for Diane, she had made choices, and they had consequences, and that was a transaction she'd entered voluntarily. More like sadness for the situation itself, for the fact that 2 80-year-old trees had to come down before any of this started. For the fact that a neighborhood that had maintained its character for decades had been made into an adversarial space by one person's inability to let something live. The canes hit 40 feet before the end of the summer. Harold came out in September to walk the grove with me. He was quiet for a long time, moving through the canes, running his hand along the smooth green surfaces, looking up at the canopy. Then he stopped in the middle of the arc and said, "Second year I've ever seen establishment this fast." "What was the first?" I asked. "Mine," he said, 30 years ago. I was angry about something too. He didn't elaborate and I didn't ask. Some things don't need the details filled in. As we walked back toward the house, Harold stopped at the edge of the planting and looked back one more time. The bamboo rose above us, the canes thick and columnar, the leaves moving in the September breeze with a sound like very gentle applause. "She's going to be magnificent," he said. "She already is," I said. "I've told this story many times now, and every time there's a moment, usually around the HOA meeting or the day the shoots came up, when the person I'm talking to gets a certain look, a satisfied look, like they're vicariously enjoying something, I understand that. There is something deeply satisfying about a story in which a wrong is answered correctly, in which someone who used institutional power carelessly discovers that the institution has limits they didn't account for, in which patience and preparation beat speed and ruthlessness. These are things we want to be true about the world, and sometimes they are, and those are good moments to sit with. But I want to tell you what I actually took away from this, because it's more complicated than the satisfaction. The first thing is this: I almost did it wrong. In those first hours after I found the stumps, there were a dozen ways I could have responded that would have felt good in the moment and made everything worse. I could have confronted Diane immediately, in the driveway, in the state I was in. I could have posted on the neighborhood Facebook page that evening, written something angry and partially accurate, and started a firestorm. I could have called a lawyer that same night. I could have done any number of things that would have released the pressure I was feeling. I didn't, and the real reason, not the strategic reason, is that I was too sad to be angry. The anger came later. In that first moment, standing in my driveway looking at the stumps, what I felt was grief. Real grief. The kind that makes you quiet and slow. And grief, it turns out, is a better starting point for decision-making than anger, because it makes you want to build something rather than destroy something. I built something. The second thing is about the rules. I have heard people express admiration for the fact that I've found a loophole or beat the system, but I don't think that's what I did. I think what I did was read the rules. Carefully, thoroughly, with a highlighter, and enough time to understand what they said. The right to plant natural vegetation on your own property. That is not a loophole. That is a right. It was written into the governing documents that every property owner in Sycamore Ridge had agreed to abide by, including Diane. The rule existed before I planted anything. I exercised a right that was already mine, that the board had already confirmed was mine, that Diane's own membership had entitled her to challenge and failed. The lesson is not find loopholes. The lesson is know your rights. Read the documents. Read the municipal code. Read the things that govern your situation, because they often contain protections you don't know you have until you need them. Third, the arborist report. People underestimate this part. Patricia Wendell's report was not ultimately the thing that stopped the HOA or drove Diane out. The bamboo did those things. But the arborist report was the foundation of everything else. It was the document that gave Mrs. Patterson something solid to stand on when she used the word fraudulent. It was the document that opened the board's procedural review. It was the document that shifted the neighborhood's understanding of what had actually happened. Document everything. When something wrong happens to you, get it on paper, get it verified, get it certified. Not so you can wave it in someone's face, but so that when the moment comes to use it, you have it. Patricia Wendell's report cost me $280. $280 for a certified arborist to come out, examine the stumps, take core samples, write a formal finding, and sign her name to it. That is not a lot of money, objectively speaking, in the context of a legal or quasi-legal dispute over property. But I know people who, in the same situation, would not have made that call. They would have told themselves they already knew the trees were healthy. They already knew the removal was wrong. They didn't need a piece of paper to confirm what they understood in their gut. They would have saved the $280 and lost something they couldn't as Healy replace. The ability to put a certified expert's name and credentials behind the fact of what had happened. Documentation is how you convert a grievance into a record. A grievance lives in your chest and makes you angry and keeps you up at night and doesn't go anywhere. A record is a different thing. A record can go into a folder. A record can be handed to a board, shared with a neighbor, submitted to a county recorder. A record can still be doing work for you 5 years later, long after the emotion behind it has settled into something quieter. Get records, keep records, pay for records if you have to. That money is never wasted. There's also something I want to say about the surveyor, because I think it illustrates the same principle from a different angle. When I hired a surveyor before the installation, some people heard that and said, "You already knew where your property line was. Why spend the money?" And the answer is, yes, I had a general sense of where my property line was. A general sense that any good faith neighbor dispute could have spent 6 months arguing over in millimeters and mixed memories. The surveyor didn't tell me where my property line was. The surveyor made it impossible for anyone to credibly dispute where my property line was. Those are two very different things. One is knowledge, the other is protection. Fourth, and this is what I come back to most, my grandfather. He planted those oaks because he came back from seeing things no one should have to see, and he needed to put something permanent in the ground. He didn't explain it much beyond that, but my grandmother's telling of it always suggested it was one of the most important things he ever did. Not the biggest, not the most visible. Important in the way that very quiet things are sometimes the most important things. I planted the bamboo for the same reason, because something had been taken that deserved to stand. Because the earth under my grandfather's house deserved to have something permanent on it. Because 80 years of history is not nothing, and you do not answer the destruction of 80 years of history with an angry post or a lawsuit that ends in a check. You answer it with something that grows. The bamboo is nearly 60 feet tall now in the established sections. Harold comes out once a year and walks it with me, and each time he says less and looks more, which I think is his version of approval. The hawks that used to nest in my grandfather's oaks moved into the upper canopy. In the bamboo's second year, a pair of red-tails that I watched build their nest over the course of a week in early March, carrying sticks up into the canes one at a time. My daughter Emma watched them with binoculars from her bedroom window for 2 weeks and named them both, though I've forgotten the names now. The grove sounds different depending on the weather. In still air, it's quiet, occasional soft knocking of one cane against another. In a light breeze, it becomes something like music, a continuous, gentle percussion that is irregular and natural. In a storm, it roars. The canes whipping and bending in ways that look alarming until you realize they've been doing this for millions of years and know exactly how to survive it. I have sat under it in all 3 conditions. I have a favorite spot about 40 feet into the arc where the canes are densest and the light comes through green and strange, and where the sound from the outside world is almost completely absorbed by the grove around you. My wife says it feels like a different country in there. I know what she means. I have started keeping a second notebook, different from the soil temperature log, which I still have, though it lives in a drawer now with a rubber band around it. This one is a grove notebook. I started it in the bamboo's 3rd year when I realized I was accumulating observations I didn't want to lose. Not measurements. Just things. The date the red-tails returned for a second nesting season. The way the lower canes develop their distinctive mottling as they age, pale green giving way to a deeper, more complex color that is somewhere between sage and olive and gold, depending on the light. The sound the grove makes after a heavy rain, when water runs down the canes in thin sheets and drips from leaf to leaf all the way to the ground, like a very patient kind of applause. The first morning, I walked out and realized the canopy had closed completely, that standing in the middle of the arc, you could look up and see nothing but green, no sky, no neighboring house, no anything except light filtered through 10,000 overlapping leaves. I stood there for a while. I didn't write in the notebook that morning. Some things deserve a moment before they get turned into words. My daughter Emma is 13 now. She doesn't remember the oaks with any clarity. She was too young, but she has grown up with the bamboo the way I grew up with the oaks. Which is to say, she has grown up understanding without being told that some things in a yard are not decoration. Some things are the yard's whole meaning. She does her homework at the picnic table on the edge of the grove on good evenings. And she has strong opinions about the hawks and tracks their movements with a seriousness that I recognize. That looks like her grandmother looking at things she cared about. She told me once, matter-of-factly, that she intends to take care of the bamboo after we're gone. I didn't ask her to say that. She just said it the way my grandmother said the trees come with it, like it was simply true and worth stating plainly. Diane sold her house in October of the bamboo's first summer. I don't know where she went. The people who bought her house are a couple in their 30s with a young son, and they have never once complained about the bamboo. The wife told Carol she thinks it's beautiful. The husband asked once if he could bring his son into the grove. I said of course. The three of us walked in together while the boy touched the canes and looked up at the canopy with an expression I recognized. The expression you have when something is too large and too old and too alive to fit inside your regular sense of the world, and you know it, and the knowing feels good. The same expression I must have had as a child looking up into my grandfather's oaks. If you're in a situation like mine, if someone has used rules against you, taken something from you, leveraged an institution to erase something you cared about, here is what I want you to hear. Read everything. Know your rights before you need them. Document the wrong, get it certified, get it on paper, keep copies. Don't move fast. Don't move angry. Move the way. Bamboo moves in winter, which is not at all just waiting root deep for the right season. And then, when the season comes, move the way bamboo moves in spring, which is to say, move like you mean to stay. Because here is the thing about bamboo that people don't fully understand until they've lived next to a grove of it. It is not aggressive. It is not vengeful. It is not trying to win anything or prove anything. It is simply alive, and it grows in the direction of light, and it has been doing that for 100 million years. And it will still be doing it when every fence on every street in every suburb in this country has been replaced 3 times over. My grandfather put something permanent in the ground because the earth deserved it. He was right about all of it. Build something that grows. Build something permanent. Give it what it needs to stand for 100 years. That's the whole lesson. That's everything.